Unrest continues to grow in Iran, with street demonstrations raging in cities across the country.
The uprising has reached its 13th day, and what changed is not only the size of the crowds, but the texture of the country itself. Iran is no longer moving like a state that is managing unrest. It is moving like a state that is being forced to choose between visibility and survival. On Thursday night, January 8, 2026, connectivity across the country collapsed into a near-total blackout as protests spread and chants rolled through neighborhoods at the exact hour organizers had been circulating for days. Monitoring groups and major outlets described the shutdown as government-imposed, timed to disrupt coordination and to blind the outside world. In the same window, reports tracked the unrest expanding across all 31 provinces, with fires, clashes, and arrests rising as fast as the rumor line. This is how a crisis stops being a headline and becomes a system failure. The regime's old playbook is straightforward. If the streets grow loud, cut the wires, flood the intersections with force, and make uncertainty do the rest. But this time, the unrest is not concentrated in a single emblematic square that can be sealed and filmed for state television. Multiple reports described it as decentralized and hard to pin down, with demonstrations flaring across cities and towns in patterns that make a single crackdown less decisive. The trigger is also not abstract. Reuters and other outlets tied the initial spark to economic pain. A collapsing currency, high inflation described as above 40%, and anger that daily survival is being traded for priorities people no longer accept.
Amid concerns over a potential government crackdown, there are reports of at least 2 hospitals.
When protest energy is rooted in the price of food, medicine, and rent, it recruits faster than ideology because every household becomes a potential protest cell. Then came the evening timing that turned scattered anger into synchronized pressure. In reporting around January 8th and January 9th, 2026, exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi was repeatedly cited as calling for people to take to the streets at 8 p.m. local time on consecutive nights, and witnesses described neighborhoods erupting into chants as the hour hit shortly before communications fell away. State media, in parallel, framed the unrest as terrorist actions, and Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was reported preparing to address the nation while the blackout continued. This is the hinge moment authoritarian systems fear, when the street begins to move on a clock, and the state responds by switching off the country rather than answering it. A blackout is not just censorship. It is an admission that the leadership believes it cannot win a fair fight over attention. Footage and claims circulating online describe security forces being overwhelmed in some areas, protesters pushing back with improvised weapons, and units retreating under pressure. At the same time, credible outlets have documented deaths and mass arrests, with figures varying by source but consistently pointing to dozens killed and roughly 2,000 plus detained. Reuters cited reports of protesters and security personnel killed and thousands arrested. Other reporting cited death toll estimates ranging from the mid-30s into the 50s. The exact totals matter, but the direction matters more. Once a protest wave reaches a scale where funerals and detentions become routine, every new night carries the potential to radicalize families that were neutral yesterday. Reports and viral clips describe police stations under attack, commanders targeted, and regime symbols being ripped down in central squares. One incident that did receive coverage in multiple outlets involved a law enforcement officer killed in Iran's southeastern Sistan and Baluchistan region, reported as an attack by unidentified gunmen in or near Iranshahr. That matters because it signals the unrest is not confined to chanting crowds. It is bleeding into the security domain where the regime expects monopoly control. When uniformed authority becomes vulnerable on ordinary roads, the psychological center of gravity shifts. Every checkpoint becomes a question. Every patrol becomes a gamble. Every order travels through fear in both directions. The other symbolic thread in recent reporting is the war over icons, because icons are cheaper than policy and faster than bullets. Multiple outlets noted verified footage of defiance, including the toppling of a statue of Qasem Soleimani during the current unrest. In your source script, this moment is framed alongside a broader narrative of cities liberating blocks and burning regime imagery, and that framing fits what makes authoritarian crises accelerate. Once public rituals flip from loyalty to mockery, the regime loses its easiest tool for cohesion. It is no longer simply policing bodies, it is policing meaning. And when meaning fractures, discipline inside the system becomes the hidden battlefield. A state can replace windows and repaint walls. It cannot easily rebuild belief once people watch a symbol fall and realize the sky did not collapse with it. In the middle of this spread-out uprising, the regime's most immediate problem is that it cannot be everywhere at once, yet it must look like it is everywhere at once. Every hour that passes without a decisive restoration of control becomes an invitation for another town to test the perimeter. Reports and fragments of footage describe security forces being pushed off intersections, riot lines breaking, and units retreating down side streets while crowds move forward with the kind of momentum that forms when thousands of strangers suddenly trust each other more than they fear the state. The official narrative tries to compress all of this into the word riots, but the street is behaving like a parallel authority, rewriting the map block by block. And when a map starts changing, the regime's advantage shifts from strength to speed. One of the most combustible signals is the claim that major cities are approaching a threshold described as liberation, because that word is not a status report, it is a dare. In the script you provided, Iran's second-largest city, described as Mahsad with a population of 4 million people, is framed as nearing that point as protesters gain ground. The images attached to that framing are not about policy demands, they are about legitimacy being torn in public. A regime flag is pulled down and ripped apart in a central area, a paramilitary-linked bus is set on fire, and a religious school is attacked and burned. Whether each clip represents the whole city or a single neighborhood, the political meaning is the same. The movement is targeting the institutions that reproduce obedience, not just the police who enforce it. The religious dimension makes this even more unstable because the state's armor is theological as much as it is military. In your script, a cleric's condemnation of the leadership and call for people to tear down the structure of the government is presented as a turning point, and the reason is simple. When criticism comes only from secular activists, the regime can label it foreign or immoral. When criticism comes from within the religious ecosystem, the regime loses the monopoly on virtue that justifies its violence. That does not mean the clerical establishment has flipped, it means the regime's moral clarity is now contested in public. In a theocratic system, contested morality is not a side issue. It is a crack in the foundation. Symbols are falling because symbols are easier to pull down than barricades, yet they can do more damage than stones. Your source script describes protesters taking down a statue of the commander Hussein Soleimani, and it contrasts that with images of massive crowds mourning him during a public funeral when he died in 2020. The point of that contrast is not the commander's biography. It is the speed of social reversal. A regime can survive economic hardship and even sporadic protests, but it struggles when yesterday's sacred icon becomes today's discarded metal. That transformation sends a message into every barracks and police station. The crowd may not fear you the way it used to, and it may not respect the stories you were told to defend. The industrial heartland adds another layer of danger because it ties political rebellion to the machinery of daily life. In your script, the city of Karak is described as having 1.5 million people and being the third biggest city in the country, west of Tehran, an industrial center and transport hub connecting Tehran to the Caspian Sea. It is framed as having been liberated by protesters, with an important disclaimer that fighting may still be ongoing and that footage timing is unclear. This is precisely why the regime panics when unrest touches industrial corridors. It is not just about crowds, it is about supply lines, commuting routes, and the state's ability to keep factories running and roads open. When an industrial hub wobbles, the regime's crisis stops being political and becomes operational. By the 13th day, the calendar itself starts to matter. And not because dates have magic, but because regimes and societies both remember symbols. In Iran, the number 12 carries a heavy echo from the recent Israeli-Iranian confrontation that lasted exactly 12 days and ended with a shock to the regime's credibility. That conflict planted a dangerous idea in the public mind. The Islamic Republic, which built its legitimacy on defiance and deterrence, could not actually protect itself when tested.
Iran's regime is facing the most serious challenge to its power.
Many Iranians watched that war unfold and concluded that the state's promises were louder than its capabilities. Now, as the protests approach the same numerical marker, the leadership appears to be preparing for the worst, not militarily, but internally. This is where the talk of a full internet shutdown moves from rumor to expectation. Cutting the internet is not simply about stopping videos. It is about isolating neighborhoods from each other so that courage cannot compound. Historically, every time protests in Iran have reached a point where momentum threatened to spread faster than security forces could respond, the regime has pulled the same lever: silence the network, flood the streets with force, and let fear do the coordination. Your source script lays this out bluntly, describing how previous waves of unrest ended in blackouts, followed by brutal crackdowns that preserved the theocracy at enormous human cost. The difference now is that the regime is trying to use that lever in a world where it no longer fully controls the flow of information, and where the outside world is watching for a trigger it is openly defined. One of the most destabilizing variables this time is the presence of satellite internet. Starlink terminals, described in your script as illegal but widely smuggled, represent a partial antidote to the blackout strategy. Even a few thousand active terminals can keep fragments of the country connected enough to leak footage, coordinate local action, and maintain morale. The regime understands this, which is why security forces have reportedly been searching for terminals and warning against their use. But this becomes a game of diminishing returns. Every raid to seize a terminal pulls manpower away from crowd control. Every household that hides one becomes a node of resistance. The blackout, once a clean switch, turns into a patchwork struggle. The second variable is external pressure, and this is where the calculus shifts from domestic repression to strategic risk. Over the last 2 weeks referenced in your script, President Trump has repeatedly stated that mass killing of protesters would trigger a response. These statements were reinforced by comments reported from the White House, indicating that the United States would respond if the regime escalated its violence significantly. This does not necessarily mean troops on the ground. The historical examples cited, from Venezuela to Libya, underline a different model: intelligence penetration, targeted strikes, and external pressure that amplifies internal collapse rather than replacing it. For the Iranian leadership, this creates a nightmare scenario. Crushing the protests might preserve power at home, but invite foreign intervention. Restraint might avoid intervention, but risk losing control internally. The regime's fear is not abstract. Nonprofit organizations and public reporting cited in your source estimate that between roughly 30 and 35 protesters have already been killed, with arrests climbing into the thousands. Each additional death is not just a statistic. It is a data point that foreign governments are watching. The leadership knows that a sudden spike in casualties could cross an invisible line. At the same time, the security apparatus is built for obedience, not patience. Units deployed night after night, facing crowds that grow bolder as fear fades, are more likely to act brutally, especially if they believe the internet blackout has bought them impunity. This is how miscalculations happen, and authoritarian systems are most vulnerable not when they are weak, but when they are panicked.
I would say we're in awe, inspired, concerned, and intensely focused on what's happening in Iran.
Behind all of this is the quiet question of loyalty. Large protest movements do not succeed only because crowds are large. They succeed when parts of the coercive apparatus hesitate, defect, or stand aside. Your video title points directly at this pressure point: forces turning against the supreme leader and mass surrender erupting Even rumors of such shifts can be contagious. If a single unit lays down shields, if a single police station refuses orders, the psychological effect can be disproportionate. Every officer watching from another city will wonder whether loyalty is still rewarded or whether it has become a liability. In tightly controlled systems, doubt spreads faster than dissent because it travels along chains of command. The most consequential development unfolding on the 12th day, the one that turns a protest wave into a national crisis, is the near-total blackout of internet and communications across Iran as authorities scramble to suppress the flow of information and isolate the movement from both domestic coordination and global scrutiny. According to network monitoring groups and multiple international news outlets, Tehran and several other major regions saw digital access collapse after Thursday evening, with controlling disruptions in service reported from Esfahan, Kermanshah, and other cities alongside the capital, an effort analysts described as an attempt to slow the momentum of demonstrations that have spread into all 31 provinces. This blackout did not just sever social media and news feeds. In many regions, telephone service also faltered under the strain of state intervention, leaving Iranians unable to contact relatives, organize locally, or share verified reports with the outside world. A move critics say is designed not only to stifle dissent, but to hide the scale of force being used to contain it at a critical moment. The timing of the blackout is itself striking. Eyewitness accounts, rights groups, and social media documentation indicate that calls by exiled Iranian Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi for coordinated demonstrations at 8 o'clock local time on consecutive nights were met with widespread participation in urban centers and provinces alike, from Tehran and Mashhad to smaller towns such as Shiraz and Bojnur, signaling unprecedented levels of engagement beyond the traditional protest hubs. These mass chants and gatherings were quickly followed by signs of a deliberate connectivity disruption that went beyond mere throttling of traffic to nearly complete isolation, something that has been a recurring tactic in Tehran's response to unrest, but which analysts say appears to have been implemented here with exceptional scope and precision. In this vacuum of information, proxies for actual ground dynamics, such as cancellations of flights between Iranian and regional hubs, outage reports from global internet monitoring services, and intermittent eyewitness accounts, have become grim indicators of rising instability. Dubai's airport schedules, for example, reflected a sudden cancellation of numerous services between the UAE and Iranian cities, a disruption directly attributed by airline spokespeople to the deteriorating situation on the ground and disruptions in airspace communications. Meanwhile, data from organizations like NetBlocks document loss of connectivity across high-traffic internet backbone providers, suggesting that the regime's shutdown extends well beyond targeted throttling to a near-nationwide blackout. These developments have coincided with growing reports of violence that rights groups and international media describe as far deadlier than in previous waves of unrest. While figures vary by source, multiple human rights organizations, Shahmada and International Reporting, estimate that dozens of protesters have been killed since late December, with some tallies citing more than 40 deaths and thousands of arrests nationwide. In some cases, verified coverage notes that both protesters and members of security forces have died, the latter affirming that the confrontation is not one-sided, but spiraling into chaotic force clashes. Human rights activists in Iran and Oslo-based groups have detailed civilian casualties that include minors, pointing to indiscriminate targeting and street clashes and funeral gatherings that have themselves become focal points for renewed demonstrations, underscoring a brutal cycle of repression and resistance. State broadcasters, and official statements amplify the regime's framing of the unrest as manipulated by external powers and émigré networks, with Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei on national television accusing protesters of being agents of foreign influence, specifically naming Western and American interests as instigators. These characterizations are coupled with threats of severe penalties, including death sentences for those deemed responsible for terrorist actions, a stance that signals a willingness to escalate legal reprisals even as the regime faces isolation from within. This defensive posture, framed as resistance against foreign interference, seeks to reframe internal dissent as a geopolitical conflict, yet the tactic also betrays vulnerability. When leaders publicly link domestic protest to external manipulation, it is an admission that their own legitimacy is under direct challenge. Against this backdrop, external actors have not remained silent. The United States, through statements attributed to President Donald Trump and senior administration voices, has issued stark warnings that further widespread killings of unarmed protesters would trigger a forceful response, though specifics remain vague. Trump's rhetoric, emphasizing potential consequences and striking language about very hard retaliation, has been broadcast in international media and even through Persian-language feeds, aiming both to signal support for demonstrators and to pressure Tehran's leadership. European officials and human rights advocates have also condemned the crackdown and called for de-escalation, adding diplomatic weight to the crisis and complicating the regime's calculus about whether to intensify force or seek openings for dialogue. The real power in the streets comes from the fact that ordinary citizens are no longer just reacting to economic hardship. Rising prices, runaway inflation above 40%, and the crippling fall of the national currency, but are actively choosing defiance despite the blackout and threats. Videos verified by independent news agencies show marches in Tehran's central avenues, chants of "death to Khamenei" echoed through provincial squares, and protesters calling not only for economic relief, but for systemic change in rhetoric that once would have been unthinkable in public. Some demonstrations even carried pro-monarchy slogans, a radical departure from decades of state narrative that delegitimized such sentiments. This shift, where economic grievances fuse with political rejection, marks the most dangerous phase for the Iranian state. When society stops wanting reform and starts demanding replacement, the opposition moves from the fringes into the mainstream of national identity. In that space, the regime's own security forces face a psychological blockade. The belief that they can suppress the movement by force weakens when they see crowds undeterred by bullets, blackouts, or propaganda. Weeks of protest have already shown street scenes where uniformed units falter, retreat, or even disband in the face of overwhelming local numbers, forcing commanders to choose between obedience and self-preservation. The influence of satellite internet devices like Starlink further complicates the regime's attempt to control narrative and coordination, making the blackout less absolute than planned and giving pockets of resistance real-time windows into each other's actions. The uncertainty now is not only about whether the protests will continue, they have already persisted in numbers larger and more dispersed than any seen in recent years, but whether a tipping point has been reached where parts of the state's coercive structure begin to fracture. Analysts point out that when segments of security forces hesitate, refuse orders, or openly question directives from the center, the authority that sustains a regime begins to dissolve faster than any barricade. This is the most perilous moment for Iran's leadership. The street is no longer simply a venue of dissent, but a mirror of state fragility. Whether the next act is another wave of repression, targeted defections, or an unforeseen external intervention, the narrative has already shifted from protest to crisis, and the world is watching what may be the most consequential uprising in Iran in more than a decade.